Hi, Graham. Welcome to the Bulletproof Entrepreneur podcast.
Alan, thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I think for once, I'm glad I'm not sitting in your studio in freezing cold London. Um, about 28 degrees and sunny outside here in Cape Town. So, yeah, such a
Oh,
pleasure to be
man,
here.
you're making me jealous because, yeah, the weather has definitely turned in the UK. There's a definite cold snap coming. And I think this is the point. This is an interesting thing because you're right. We normally do host these podcast episodes in a studio in London, but we've gone back to the original digital studio. And there's a particular reason that we're going to do that in this way. And it is something new. It's a bit of an experiment we're going to try. And I think hopefully it's going to be really interesting and valuable. I just want to sort of say at the top of this conversation, when I started this podcast, about 3 years ago, the real purpose was to provide some value, some content, some ideas, and input to the kind of SME, entrepreneurial community in the UK and around the world. And I've had many conversations with successful entrepreneurs, and some have been, shared their story and the ups and downs. And I've had a number of other people come in, from professional services, tax advisors, legal experts, etc., so that we can over time build a really, valuable body of work that any entrepreneur and business owner can just tap into and say, that was valuable and that was interesting. And really, that's why I invited you on today, because I think what you're doing right now, from what I've seen of it, is really interesting and definitely valuable for a number of business owners. So that all being said, I'd love if you could just to go back and maybe sort of put some color on this. Give me a bit of information about your own personal sort of backstory, your journey, and what brought you to launch the business that we're going to be speaking about today. What's your sort of backstory, Graham?
Oh, yeah, I mean, how far back do we want to go, Alan? But no, jokes aside, I think, the story that I tell, and this is my real journey, I guess, is that my dad is what I call a failed entrepreneur, and I say it in the nicest possible way. He's probably the world's best dad and human being. But it was in an industrial town in South Africa in the sort of early 90s. He was in his early 40s, and he got laid off. Ford had pulled out of South Africa, at the end of the apartheid era. Um, and he was never formally employed again after that. And he became, essentially a handyman. That's probably the best way to describe it. A one-man band. He was a millwright by training. Um, and in those days, kind of entrepreneurship was something that you did if you couldn't get a job. So I remember I was a teenager at the time, and it was like, now all of a sudden he didn't have the company car, and you would arrive at school in like his, secondhand tapped out bucky, or bucky
Mm,
for those in the UK is basically like a truck. So,
right.
um, and I swore that I would do things the right way. I'd go and study as a chartered accountant, get a job in a big bank, and go the safe route, the big bonuses, the corporate career, all of those things. Um, and the irony is, I was 42. It was 2 days after my 42nd birthday, the same age that my dad got laid off, that I first became, I guess, an entrepreneur. I started my own business. And that was 6 years ago, operating as a fractional CFO. In the run up to that, I had done various things. I'd worked in big banks, I'd worked in other people's startups, I'd worked in entrepreneurial type ventures, but always somebody else's dream and vision. And one of my first clients actually is now my co founder and partner with Bizval, Howard Blake. He was going through, I call it a bit of a rich dad, poor dad story. At the time, Howard was late 50s. He was busy on about his 40th venture. And he was in the process of actually exiting his first and biggest venture at the time. He had just been faced by a £50,000 bill from one of the big four, who shall remain nameless,
Okay.
um, in terms of evaluation and a bit of an exit plan. And he kind of felt that it didn't add any value. So he actually approached me to kind of do a valuation on his business and ask him as he was going through this, or ask me as he was going through this process, Graham, what are the three or four things that you think I need to be aware of going into this negotiation? And naively, I had a background obviously in understanding valuations and business sales and what have you. And I put together sort of a 5-page memo for him. We did a full-on, investment grade valuation, but presented in plain language. And we had sort of like a 4-page report around, think about the following 4 things to make sure you get the best deal possible.
Mm.
And I charged him, I think, way too little in hindsight, but a
Yeah.
fraction. And he sat and he said, look, I've been through, 20, 30 different business exits. I, as the founder, have never understood this stuff. I'm not a finance person. And for the first time, this makes sense. It's a bit of a long backstory. Um, and a few days later, he said, listen, I think we need to create a business out of this. He said, we need to disrupt this space. Every single entrepreneur I know has been through this journey about thinking about an exit. So that was sort of the original idea or seedling behind Bizval. We wanted to create a mechanism to help entrepreneurs to understand the value of the business that they were creating, ways to improve that. And obviously, it's evolved a little bit since then. We do full scale professional grade valuations, but we've never lost 3 things: the sense of meeting the entrepreneur where they're at in their journey and presenting things to them in very clean and simple and plain language, if you want to call it that. While maintaining the sort of professional integrity that you would expect from a big firm. Um, and then obviously delivering that at speed and cost, which doesn't make you want to have a heart attack when you're presented with the bill. So yeah, that's kind of the sort of 5-minute quick elevator version of
Yeah.
my backstory. And yeah, such a pleasure to be here today and hopefully share a little bit more of why that matters to your audience, Alan.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think that's where when our paths crossed, and you and I, we met in London earlier this year. And I was intrigued because, as you know, I spend a lot of my time in the entrepreneurial world in London and in the UK. And this is something that does crop up reasonably regularly. And it's great. There was a meeting of minds, obviously, with your co-founder, business partner. Obviously, he's clearly a serial entrepreneur with 40 odd businesses behind him, and that sort of meeting your, I guess, your technical, your finance, your analytical side of what you were bringing to it, and I just love these stories, which is solving a problem that there's a problem that
Mhm.
exists. There's not a natural solution to it, and just sort of disrupting that existing large and for a lot of business owners very costly process that many go through. But let me dig a little bit deeper on that. So
Mhm.
fundamentally, this is if you're running a business, it's going to be valuable if you're a reasonably mature business, I guess, or you are heading towards an exit at the next year or 2 or 3, or maybe even if there's just there's a financial transaction. Maybe you're doing some fundraising. So the idea, if I get it correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, is getting a valuation which you can stand behind, that let's say a bank or an investor or a buyer could say, yeah, that's legit. It's not sort of back of an envelope, someone's made it up, but without having to spend the 50 grand or whatever that you might otherwise have to speak. Have I got that
Mhm.
right? Is that kind of the problem that you're solving?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, so we kind of break it into 2 things. That entrepreneur who's building towards something. And if I can throw a few stats in, Alan, is,
Yeah.
there's various views on this, but about 80% of, owner-led businesses never end up selling. Okay. Um, and
Right.
this kind of gets to the heart of that. So the first problem we're trying to solve is to say, look, actually, we want to help that 80% drop. We want to make sure that more business owners don't necessarily sell, but have the option of selling. And you can only sell a business, and the business only has value, you know, if it is of value to somebody else. Okay. So you've got to look at it through the lens of a prospective buyer. They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, not
Yeah.
through your lens. So a lot of business owners, they get to their 60s, they get to their 50s, they've built a great lifestyle. They've extracted a lot of money out of the business, but it's not inherently sellable or valuable to somebody else. So we help kind of unlock that and help business owners understand what that looks like, what do they need to do, how do they plan ahead, and how do they create optionality for themselves to either sell, keep the business, extract a dividend, but give them real choices. You don't want to be 65 years old and you have to stay in the business and you hate it, and your family wants you to spend more time with them, but you're stuck. And then
Mm.
the second thing we have is when life happens. Okay. The
Right.
reality is people get divorced.
Mm.
Uh, you might even get an offer unexpectedly for your business. Is it a good offer or not? You don't know. You might have a separation from your business partner. You might be emigrating and having to pay exit taxes and those sorts of things. So we deal with those. Those are the two problems we solve. One is helping entrepreneurs understand and unlock value in their business, and two is when life events happen, we present an affordable, professional, and pragmatic alternative to having to spend lots of money to do these things. So
Mm.
I guess that's the problem that we solve.
That's the problem you solve. That's effectively, in a nutshell, your value proposition. Um,
Yeah.
and and I think from what I've seen, because I'm aware there's a number of online valuation tools. I've used them myself in the past.
Mm.
I don't know, the accuracy is questionable. They're using very generic data. They're using whatever industry you're in. The one I looked at a while ago, whatever industry you're in, they give you just a multiple, an EBITDA multiple based on the
Mm.
industry averages sort of thing. But it's not, as we know, every business is unique. Every business has got its own sort
Mm.
of positives and negatives and challenges and things they should fix. And I think that's the sense that I got. Yours is far more granular, and it is, frankly, to the level that if you were to pay one of these sort of big accounting or consulting firms for evaluation, you're kind of pretty close to that level of depth and detail and analysis without the huge bill. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
I think that's a fair summation. Obviously we've got different tiers, So I think what
Hmm.
we're going to show today in a bit of a demonstration is what we call sort of our online tool. At the end of the day, what you put in, garbage in, garbage out, right? So
Yeah.
that's important. But there's some fundamentals. So whether you use what we call our advisory offering, which we're going to demonstrate today, hopefully, through to hey, I need something that's defensible in front of the tax authorities. It's the same methodology.
Hmm.
So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll say, Alan, is it's not about an online tool. For us, technology, and now with AI developing and all of those sorts of things, it's just becoming, you know, more options and all of those sorts of things. It's just the tool. And one of the things we
Right.
realized early on when we started the business, we thought, hey, we'll create this online platform that is self-service. We underestimated the emotional piece, the human piece. And we actually changed our business model quite early on to say every single valuation we do will have a human-led engagement. Okay.
Right.
So even if you're doing something online with us, there will be a person, a professional person guiding you through the process, having the discussion to understand both the emotional aspects and make sure that you're putting the right stuff in. Okay.
Hmm.
Because most business owners don't and do that in a way that doesn't make the business owner feel stupid. I mean, I remember back to my early conversations with Howard is like, yeah, you as a finance person know what DCF means or
Yeah.
whatever jargon you can come up with. But me as the business owner, I don't understand that. I understand cash in my bank. How do you bridge that gap? So yeah,
Man, that's funny.
that's what some of the
I'm glad
differences.
he said that. A really successful entrepreneur, because I got to say, I've often felt that myself. Despite the fact that I,
Yeah.
effectively run a financial services business, it's not my strong point. Is knowing all these, as you say, yeah, and you do enter a different world when you get into the worlds of sort of valuing businesses and exit strategies. And you're right, discounted cash flow and all the various options that exist. I don't think I'm alone. I think a lot of entrepreneurial people had an idea to start a business, and they've often, they would hire an
Mm,
accountant, to do the tax compliance and what have you. But you get this, as we know, for most business owners, I mean, your business partner is the exception, but for most, it's a one-off thing. You don't do this too many times.
mm,
For most, it's once. You build a business, you have some sort of liquidity event, and it
yeah.
often is the only time you do it. So you've got one chance to get this right. And if you're entering a world where it's not your strong point, you're not an expert on
Mm,
it, it can be complex and challenging and hard to really understand. And you certainly don't want to make an error in this, which could have a material impact on, I guess, for the rest of your life. So I think this is it's very interesting to understand that it's trying to almost like normalize some of the words, the jargon, and the analysis. And I'm pleased to hear that you build, there's a human element to this as well. So just doing a simple online
mm.
valuation is one thing, but having the conversation with people around that, about all the other factors, I think is very, very important. Um, and the other thing, and we should probably just in a moment go into this because, and this was the big experiment because we've never done this before. We're going to do a screen share. So if people are listening to this, it might obviously they can't see it, and I would encourage them just to check it out on YouTube. But we'll certainly we'll sort of talk through the data and the figures and the numbers, so you probably can get the majority of the information, but simply by listening to this episode. Because the other thing I found quite intriguing was you can get a valuation, which is I would say pretty damn accurate. But what's more important is how can we improve that valuation? What are the kind of levers that can be pulled? And I found that when I had a look at it, I thought that's worth exploring because why wouldn't anyone wish to enhance and improve their valuation? Are you able to do to give us a demo and show us what this facility and this tool can do?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think what we're going to do today, Alan, is we're going to run through a real life scenario, okay, and we'll do a demonstration around that. And as you rightly said, I'm going to kind of talk through that. So if you're listening in, you don't have access to screen at this point. Hopefully, it makes sense. I've done this
Yeah.
a few times, so
Okay.
but and I think the point that you talk about as well, I just want to highlight that is people sometimes get obsessed with what's my number, what's the headline number, and I just want to use a quick analogy before we dive into the example. It's a bit like your health, right? Um, you can go and have a annual health check. Me as a male of a certain age, I'm getting to that age where I have to go for these annual checks. I'm not quite there yet. I think you might just be over that hump.
Yeah. Well,
And
funnily enough, I do go for a medical checkup once a year. And I get a lot of data, and it
exactly.
is AI enabled. But yeah, that's another story. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, so in that process, you do a bunch of things. You check your cholesterol, you check your blood sugar. If you're a male, they stick probes up certain bits, which are which are was not that pleasant. But anyway, you come out of that, and your physician or your doctor says to you, "Listen, yeah, Alan or Graham, if you want to live to be 80, hey, you're on course or you're not. You need
Right.
to drink less, you need to exercise more, you need to eat healthier." That is probably almost more important than whether you live to 80 or 81. Okay. If, he says you're going to live to 55 and you're 54, then you've got a problem. It's too late to make those changes. So, I think I just want to emphasize that. And I think the demo we're going to go through is going to highlight that. So, what we're going to do is, case study. I'll share my screen in a second so people can follow.
Mhm.
But if I can, Alan, maybe I can just kind of lay out the sort of case study that we're going to go through. And then we'll go through that step by step on how we value the business. So we'll use our online platform. Obviously, bigger or more complicated businesses, we would use a slightly more, let's call it, detailed offline approach. But for the
Right.
most part, we valued using this platform, we valued 500 million pound businesses and bigger. And,
Right.
they've come in within range, but that's based on information that's available. If you need to probe and go deeper, that's when sort of, it's a bit more of a, I wouldn't say robust process, but a more sort of offline process.
Sure.
So this example is a fairly typical business. Let's call it Brightwave Marketing as an example. So we're going to take a typical marketing agency. I'm going to make a few assumptions about that business. They're based in London. If I'm looking down, I do have some notes. I'm not
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
at
We
the
get.
camera like my PR coach will tell me to do. But they've got a turnover of 10 million pounds a year, a profit before tax, so they are making money of £1.5 million. They've got a revenue mix of 50% of their revenue is retainer income, so it's locked in. They get it every month.
Mm.
But they've got one large client, okay, who represents 50% of their business. So 50% of their business comes from, let's call it the BBC, okay, and the other
Okay.
50% comes from a mix of other people. There's high owner dependency. So it's a small team, and the owner's doing a lot of the stuff themselves. They're the face of the business. And whilst they're profitable, they're not growing very quickly. They're growing at 3% a year. So that's the sort of setting that we're going to paint.
So,
What
so
we're
can
going
I
to do
just so
now.
just to interrupt you for a second there, just because what listening to you, Graham, what you said there, you've obviously gone into more depth than the the data that you've said it's a 10 million turnover business. They're making profit. They're making about a 15% margin, which is not unreasonable, I think, for that kind of
Yeah,
agency. type business. But you've got there's more what I would call sort of softer facts like owner dependency and concentration around one bigger client, and that presumably
Yeah,
comes out either in the dialogue, the discussions, or by the system. Yeah, as I say, you're going to another level of information.
100%. So as we go into this valuation, I'm going to, talk through that,
Right, got it. Okay, sorry
and
to
we'll
interrupt.
show
You
how
go
we
ahead.
factor that in the valuation. So I'm going to click share on my screen,
Yeah,
and all being well, we'll bring the window open. And Alan, you can just give me a thumbs up or an
thumbs
A when
up,
you can
Graham.
see that.
Thumbs up. I can see that. Yeah,
Okay. So the way we think about the valuation is we can count it along the top. There's about 7 steps we go through. Okay. The first section is just sort of demographic information that we capture. Then we're going to go through a bit of information about getting to know the business. Then we're going to talk about how it makes money. Okay. And then we'll break down a few things after that. How do you manage your cash, your working capital? What does your balance sheet look like? So, what assets do you have? Who do you owe money to? How much money do you have in the bank? And then, importantly, we're going to understand what are the growth plans and some other factors around the business. So, at its essence, evaluation is about how much money does the business make now? How much does it make into the future? And how repeatable and sustainable is that without the owner being there? Um, that's at its core what evaluation is about.
mm, yeah.
There's a bunch of different methods, and we'll go into those as we go through. But without further ado, I'm going to go into this example. The first thing is just capturing some basic information. So, Alan, I'm going to use your details. I'm going to say the owner's name is Alan Smith.
Yeah.
I'm capturing and typing as we go along. And the company we're talking about is Brightwave Marketing, as I said. You can capture your VAT number. It's an optional thing. And then I'm just going to put Alan at, sorry, I don't want to show your email if anybody's seen that, but at
That's fine. Yeah,
test.co.uk.
yeah.
So
Got it. Okay.
we're acting as a lead magnet here for you, Alan.
Perfect. Love it.
Doesn't want to pick that up. I've got a space in there. Okay. So then we go through to a few more other details. I'm just going to put an address detail in here. I'm going to leave this blank. I'm just going to put some dots in here.
Right.
A town, city, zip code, state, and we're going to say it's a UK-based company. Okay. So our platform works wherever you are in the world. Each country has got local adaptations and risk factors and all of that. But we do an example for the United Kingdom at the moment. Okay. So the first section I said is getting to know your business. You can see there are 6 key questions here. What's the legal structure of the business? What sector is it operating in? The age of the business, your region of operation. So are you operating in the UK, the US, Europe, the currency that you're reporting your numbers in, and how many employees do you have? What this does is it really just frames the key risk factors around your business. If you're a marketing business, it might have very different risk factors to if you are a technology AI business, for argument's sake, or a manufacturing business. If you're operating in a country with high inflation and a weak currency and a small market, very different to operating in the United States or the United Kingdom, for argument's sake. So that's what this does, is getting to know your business.
Right.
So let's go through it for Brightwave Marketing. We said it's a company. They're operating in the sector we're going to take is I'm going to select media. We said they're a marketing media company.
Mm-hmm.
They've been going for a long time. They're more than 10 years old. The operations are primarily in the United Kingdom. They're reporting in pounds, and they've got between 6 and 20 employees. Okay. So I don't know if there's any questions from you at this stage, but
No, I
just some
think
basic
that's
information about the business.
yeah, that's great. That's just basic information, and that again, that just feels about right in terms of that sort of size of business and its turnover and head count, number of employees, etc. So yeah, this is a fairly typical kind of classic small medium-sized enterprise that is
Correct.
growing not particularly fast, but it's still, sustained, been going more than 10 years. So I'm imagining what this business is like. There's probably a couple of owners. It's throwing
Yeah.
off a decent income for them. They're probably paying dividends and have, a relatively comfortable lifestyle. And I'm guessing through this scenario, and you and I haven't rehearsed this particularly, these owners are of a certain age, or maybe there's just, they're just considering their options for the future. That is kind of, we're coming to the end of the year, and often people sit back and say, right, what are we going to do next year? It will be no surprise to you from what you've probably heard about the UK right now is in a kind of challenging environment, I would say, overall for small
Yeah.
business owners. There's a lot of kind of headwinds coming at us, and people are kind of reviewing their options, deciding, do we kind of go again? Shall we raise some money and really double down on growth, or do we have an exit, or bring in some other part? There's a lot of kind of options that people are increasingly considering. So this feels like, about right for from what you've said so far in terms of a typical client situation.
100%. And as we're going through this example, this is typically the conversation when customers come to us in this situation. I'm thinking about exiting, or I'm planning ahead.
Mm.
What we're going to go through now is what we is almost a pause and replay of the conversation we would have with the real customer. So you're going to have to
Yeah.
role play a little bit, Alan, as we go through
No,
this.
you go ahead. Just ask me
Yeah.
if you want.
Okay. So the next thing is we talk about is how do you make money? So we don't go and upload your last 5 years worth of income statements and balance sheets from Zero or QuickBooks or whatever platform you're doing. This part is designed to have a conversation with a business owner. And most business owners will understand these questions and, have them at the tip of their fingers. If they don't, it also tells us a little bit about, how close they are to their numbers and that. So let's use that example we spoke about. Is we said their total sales is 10 million pounds a year. Okay, so I'm going to capture in 10 million pounds a year worth of sales. It's a marketing media business. Let's say they have got some cost of sales. There's production costs, there's some freelancers and that which they capture through in their cost of sales line. So I'm going to put 3 million pounds over there. And then we ask two really important questions: is what percentage of turnover is contributed by your three largest customers combined? And this is really important because your concentration risk impacts how valuable your business is. So think about it practically. If you've got one big
Mm.
client and they go under or they go insolvent, your business is gone. If you've got 100 smaller clients, your chances are that you lose one of them, you still have a business. So yeah, in this case, I think we said that 50% was coming from one big customer. Let's call it the BBC in this case. I'm going to say 50 to 75% of revenue was from one customer. Um, and then we
Yeah, this
said,
this is the
what
point.
percentage
Sorry
of,
to interrupt, Graham. This is the point. I
yeah,
guess as you're building this, is beginning to get into the mindset of your buyer, because you may well be doing
correct.
10 million turnover and what have you. You think you've got a valuation worth X because your friend sold a similar business last year for that. However, you've
Yeah,
got half of your revenue from one source that could, and it's interesting with the BBC, they've got their own challenges right now, which is a whole other story for another podcast, not this one. But you know what I mean. This is, if I am buying that business, that's a red flag to me, and that's going to definitely impact my valuation, or the valuation that I'd be
one,
prepared to pay for this business. So you're beginning to sort of ask some of these softer facts and questions, and pull out from the founder what the other level. Once you've got the headline data and numbers, let's go down to the next level of how's the business set up. What's the structure?
100%. And just having this conversation is important. And a number of owners or founders we talk to, and we say, well, what percentage of your revenue comes from your three biggest customers? And they're like, draw a blank, and they're like, well, actually, I don't know.
Mm.
Um, that even just knowing that, and knowing that if you want to sell one day, you need to think about these things, you take value out of this conversation. So absolutely right, Alan.
Yeah.
Um, the next one's about recurring income, and recurring income doesn't mean you have, a subscription with a card and repeat income. In fact, sometimes the best form of recurring income is when it's not contractual. You've got customers who've been with you for 20 years and they keep coming back because you're delivering great service and what have you. So recurring income is really how many of your customers come back consistently. And again, in this example, I think we said that 50% of, let me put 25 to 50% is recurring income, which is not atypical for a marketing
Hmm.
type business. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what we ask around the revenue side of the business. Then we ask about some expenses, and I'm going to go through this quite quickly.
Sure.
When we laid out the case study, we said they were making about 1.5 million profit before tax. Okay. Um, so we ask if there's any inventory in the business. This type of business doesn't have inventory. It's a marketing agency. We then ask a really important question around what are your annual salary and wage costs, excluding the owner of the business? So everybody else except the owner or the management team, what are their annual salary and wage costs? So I'm going to put in a number here of, let's call it 3 million quid. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then we say, what is a fair market salary for the owner, CEO of the business? Now, this is super, super important because a lot of businesses say, well, I'm making all this profit, but the owner's not drawing a salary. Now, if a buyer is going to come in and buy this business, mostly they're not going to want to be doing the work. They don't want to buy a job. So you have to factor in, if somebody's buying your business, what would they pay a replacement CEO? Okay. Other instances, the owner might be overpaying themselves. So what we do is we normalize the cost of a CEO. So I'm going to put in 200,000 quid. Yeah, don't shoot me over this, but let's say that's a fair market salary for a medium-sized marketing agency. Okay.
Yeah.
We then ask about marketing and advertising expenditure. So we break down some of the expenses. We also ask, do you own the property you operate from? Now, this is important. We're valuing the business. So if the business owns a property, that property has a value and the operating business has a value. But nowadays, a lot of people work from home or they might have a different asset. There's no rental cost coming through. So you have a choice to say you own the property. I'm going to go say no in this case. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see the next question then changes. It says, what are your annual rental and property expenses? If I say I own the property, the next question would see, what would you charge a tenant rent per year? So it's a bit like that owner question is we try and normalize this because an investor looks at the business through the lens of what's a fair market rate for rent? What's a fair market rate for the owner? Makes sense, Alan?
Yep. Completely makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to put a rental cost in here. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in what are your other cash operating expenses? So at the end of the day, as I said earlier, it's how much cash is this business generating? Okay. So a bit of the back of the matchbox calculation over here is we said about a 1.5 million profit. So I'm going to put 2 million quid a year in cash expenses in, and I'm going to click next. And it says your estimated normalized profit before tax is circa 1.5 million pounds. So this is just a bit of a reasonability check. If you put in a wrong number or what have you, you can always go back and change that. But this is
Yeah, I like that
normalized.
because
Sometimes what happens if a
the question, and it says that the number pops out from the data you put in, and it just says, does this seem
Correct.
reasonable? Because any owner
Yeah.
would know, that's ballpark, but it's not exactly spot on. But if it was a crazy number, you'd say, no, that's way out. We must have had some inputs in wrong. But I like how that's questioned. It's just like, does this seem reasonable? Is this fair?
100%. And normally they'll have their latest management accounts or financials available, but even if they don't, they would have a good feel around that.
Yeah.
If they don't have a feel about that, it also is actually super, super important because there's a different conversation to be had. If everyone says as a business owner, you need to know your numbers. Sometimes we get that number being quite different. They're expecting it to be 5 million and it's 1.5 million. And then you break it down and you say, oh, well, but you forgot about you're not paying yourself a salary, or you should be paying 1 million quid a year in rent and you're not. So if the number's different, it's important to unpack why that number's different. Okay, let me go through the next two sections quite quickly. This is about your working capital. So the next question is there any excess cash in the business? So sometimes if an owner's never paid a dividend and they've got an investment account sitting there could be a lot of extra cash in the business. Now, generally, rule of thumb, we say, 3 months worth of working capital to pay expenses, pay wages, all of that is how much cash you need in your business. Anything over that usually would be excess cash. So in this case, I'm going to say there's no excess cash. They've always paid out their profits as a dividend, as we spoke about earlier. So I'm going to put the excess cash as 0. And then how you manage your working capital is important. So do your customers pay you on time? Do you pay your suppliers on time? So there's two questions here. How many days do your customers take to pay you usually? So it's cash on delivery, 10 days, 10 to 30 days, 30 to 60 days, more than 60 days. I suppose I shouldn't make any political judgment or anything over here, given who I said the client was. But
Mm.
let me say 30 to 60 days is the usual time for customers to pay this business. And then how many days do you take to pay your suppliers? Okay, and I'm going to say in this case we pay our suppliers, between 10 and 30 days.
Right.
All right. Any questions on that, Alan? Can I move on?
You can move on, but that's really just to understand sort of the cash flow within the business. It's money in versus
Yeah.
money out, and your kind of balance sheet, the money you've got on the books, on the balance sheet right now, which all, I guess, feeds in. I get this sense that this is kind of you reverse engineering what a buyer or some sort of that value which is sort of right. They would ask all these questions obviously to arrive at there. If you have I don't know, a trade buyer or a private equity or something, they're going to be going in and asking all these questions. So you're doing a similar approach via this
Yeah.
methodology, which makes perfect sense to me. So where do we go next?
Okay, so where we go next? I just want to emphasize that point quickly. I mean, we originally had a tagline, an investment banker in your pocket, and you spot on. We look at this as a investment banker or professional buyer would, but obviously we've stripped away all the noise and got to the essence.
Mm,
Now, when you get to that point of doing what we call a due diligence or diving into the detail, you'll need to go and validate that these numbers that are being projected are actually true. Okay.
yeah, oh, for
Um,
sure.
yeah,
By the way,
yeah.
I like that investment banker in your pocket. It worked well for Apple, didn't it? With 10,000 songs in your pocket or whatever. So
And
yeah,
we should
that makes
we should
sense.
trademark that.
You should quickly. All right.
Okay, so then we talk about the balance sheet, so property, plant, and equipment, and then any debt and liabilities. So the first question we ask is what's the replacement value of any equipment, vehicles, or any fixed assets? So we're not saying what's the new value or what's the balance sheet value, but if you're to take, the computers, the laptops, if it's a manufacturing business, the machinery, practically what could you get on the second-hand market? Now, I'm not going to dwell on that now, but
Mm,
it's important for two reasons because a lot of businesses, particularly capital heavy businesses like manufacturing businesses, they've got all this equipment. It's fully depreciated. There's no expense going through the income statement, but that stuff needs to be replaced eventually. So
mm,
you need to factor in, and a buyer will look at that and they say, oh, all your equipment's old. I need to invest money, capex. Okay, so we try to create a proxy for that. So in this example, it's probably irrelevant, but I'm going to say there's a few laptops, machines, office desks, and furniture. So let's say there's 200,000 quid worth of assets. And then do you owe any money to banks or third parties? So, your business can be worth, let's say, 10,000 quid or 10 million quid. But if you've funded that and you owe the bank 10 million quid,
mm.
then actually it's worth nothing. It's like if you buy a house and you've got a mortgage against that, um, there's no money in your pocket if you sell the house. You pay the mortgage and off you go. So we ask that question: is there any debt owed to a bank or a third party? So I'm going to say in this case there is none. The answer is no.
Yeah.
Obviously, the next question is grayed out, so we would ask what the outstanding balance is. I'm going to move on from there. Okay. And then the last set of questions is evaluation by its nature is forward looking. What happened 10 years ago doesn't really matter. Okay. It's
Mm,
like your life expectancy example. What does the future look like? And
yeah.
again, when we do this, you need to interrogate, are these plans reasonable? But we first talk about growth. So how quickly can the business grow? And we break that down into the next 12 months and then the subsequent 36 months. So for this business, we said it was growing at between 3% a year, so 0 to 5%. I put those in as numbers. The phase of business. This is important. So we've got three options here. The business is well established and it's growing consistently. So it's it's a good business.
Mm,
It's
hmm.
facing challenges and it's responding with changes. So, I'm experiencing a few health issues. Not everything's quite right.
Mm,
Or it's a startup, or if it's pivoted and we've changed direction. Again, this sets some of the base risk level that an investor would look at. An established business is a lot less risky than one that is just getting out of the starting blocks. So
sure.
I'm going to say it's a well-established business. Okay. Any questions on that, Alan?
No, that all makes perfect sense. We've said this business has been around for what do we say, 5 to
For a
10
while,
years or
yeah.
something. So it's been around for a number of years. So it is definitely less risky than one that's been around for 3 years, for sure.
Exactly. And then
Yeah,
the
makes
last
sense.
two questions is, what describes your expenses and infrastructure? very simple answers. My expenses are sufficient, but they will increase as revenue increases. They're
Mhm.
insufficient and I need to invest more, so actually I need to employ more people. Okay. Or they're larger than required and I can grow off the current expense base. So I'm going to tick the top one again. Okay. They're
It's
sufficient,
quite
but
interesting
as
on this.
revenue grows, I need to.
This demands some, I guess, some rigorous honesty from the founder who's
Yep.
inputting the details, because I can see where this is headed. If you say I'm going to have to invest a lot more, my expenses are going to go up. That's going to
Yep.
impact the valuation. If the buyer says, "Well, we're going to have to carry the cost of those additional expense capex," then I'm going to pay you less for it. So but it is a classic.
Yeah.
It's data in, data out. If you're going to kind of try to hack the system, is not necessarily going to give you a more accurate value. So I think just being candid, being honest, being you, and I guess this is no one else necessarily needs to see these valuations either. This is something that a business owner can do
Yep.
themselves or with their colleagues or with their accountant and what have you, and get a sense of it. So again, being completely honest and deliberate about the inputs you put in here at this stage, which again is more the kind of the softer facts as opposed to the hard-nosed data. So again, all makes perfect sense. So where does this take us to
Abs-
now then, Graham?
Absolutely. And that honesty fact is so important. You're just kidding yourself if you're lying in these numbers. The last question, and this is my favorite one, is if you take a 3-week holiday, what happens? Okay.
Mm,
Um, because we spoke about, are you the business? Is it a business that runs without you, or are you the business? And this is one of the single biggest reasons why businesses don't get the value that they could, or why they can't sell in the first place. Okay. And we have three
right.
options here. I can go away for 3 weeks without the internet and the business is unaffected, through to no holidays currently. I'm involved in the business 24/7. I can't even take I'll be PC. We're talking to a British audience, a comfort break.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Without the business stopping. So in this case, I'm going to say there is quite a high reliance. The owner is very involved. He can barely take a 3-day holiday, let alone 3 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to tick that box.
Right.
What this then does, in the background, it adds all this stuff out. It builds out a 5-year income statement, goes and does all the heavy lifting. It gives you an opportunity just to check the numbers again, and we click submit. And then the little investment bank in the pocket goes away, and it pops out a number. Okay.
Hmm.
And it gives a range of valuation from between £3 million to £4 million. Okay. Our midpoint here is about 3.6. It's got three different methods for valuing the business. Okay, you remember the profit year was 1.5 million a year, so you do the maths around that. We have a discounted cash flow view, that's sort of a forward-looking view on the business. We
Hmm.
have an earnings multiple view, which is it looks at similar businesses, similar stage, what would they be selling for, and then the net asset value is what can you sell the assets for, money in the bank, all of those sorts of things. So the way I explain this often to clients is your discounted cash flow is inherently forward looking. It's what you would like to get. If it's a growing business, that's usually the highest value. But a
Yeah.
buyer, and that's usually where an owner would start his negotiations in the potential sale. A buyer is normally going to say, "Well, I'm not paying you for future earnings. I'm only paying for you for what you're doing currently."
Hmm.
Um, and that usually is the earnings multiple number. And usually that number is lower unless the business has suddenly gone backwards
Hmm.
than the discounted cash flow number. And then the net asset value is what's the business worth dead rather than alive. If you shut it down and you sold off all the assets, that's potentially what you could get. So those
Right.
are just different methods that make up the valuation. They weighted differently, but this is a sense check on what the valuation is. Um, the
Yeah. So in
last
this
point I
in
want to.
this case, you're arriving at it looks like the midpoint is about just under 3.7 million as a valuation for you right now. It could be lower, could be higher.
Correct.
And I guess that's when, if it was real life, you'd enter into negotiations, and you're trying to negotiate a higher value, discounted cash flow. The buyer wants to chip you on that potentially, but at least you've got a starting
Yeah.
framework. Then that's roughly so. If you were speaking to this business owner, this sort of medium-sized marketing business, you would say this is what you could potentially get right now without, if you just put it up for sale right now. Yeah,
100%.
that's
Yeah.
that's a reasonable, and it can be validated. It's got all the. I'm looking at it now, all the kind of as you say, the 5-year income
Mm.
statement, just based on future projections on all the numbers that have been put in. So again, a buyer
Yeah.
would definitely do that. They'd plug this all into their magic Excel machine, and it would kick out a version of this, right?
spot on. And yeah, what I'm showing you on the screen is exactly that. With it, this is the 5-year income statement that supports that valuation. This is, what a buyer is going to look at. And as you can see
Mm,
here in this instance, right, is that the revenue is increasing, the gross profit's increasing, but actually the operating profit, the profit before tax is actually going backwards. Okay. It's still
mm,
profitable, but you're making less money in year 5 than you are currently. And this is not even yet inflation adjusted and all those things. So
mm.
this business, whilst it's currently profitable, is actually not dying a slow death, but it's not as healthy as it looks at first glance. Okay.
Yeah, it's
And
not
that's super important
thriving.
because
It's not a thriving business, is it? It's doing okay. It's ticking along. I think there's a lot of businesses like that. Frankly, they're treading water. They're doing fine. They're still throwing
yeah,
off a nice dividend for the owner, and they're probably thinking, well, everything's fine. Everything's okay. We might sell
yeah,
in the next couple of years. But this, once you get into the weeds on the data and do some, reasonable forward projections, you begin to see a couple of red flags here just currently, which again is, information is like gold. You can just begin to think about
yeah.
this, and if should you wish to, begin to take some action around it. But okay, this all looks good so
And that's
far.
where the real value comes in. So I'm going to show what we call our scenario test now. Okay, so if I look at this business, there's 3 key things which are kind of holding back value. There's heavy client concentration. There's quite a high dependence on the owner, and there's fairly low growth. Okay, so those
Mm,
are the 3 things that the owner would want to know about. So what then happens is we go to we've built what we call a scenario tool or sensitivity tool. So we take that
mm,
valuation, it pulls up all the key data that we've put in, and we can now say, oh, I don't like that scenario. For me to retire to the south of Spain, 3.3 million or 3.6 million is not going to cut it. I need 8 million quid. Okay. So
mm,
what we can then do is it's a very simple slider based thing. I'm going to run a very simple scenario here. We say in this case, we know that the factors were over reliance on one customer, lack of management depth, and limited sales diversification. So let's assume the following. Uh, this guy needs to hire a 2IC. He needs to bring in an operator who can run the business to reduce his dependence, and it could cost him 150,000 quid a year. He doesn't want to do it currently because that 150,000 quid a year,
mm.
is the difference between flying first class on his holiday as opposed to economy class. So he's living the lifestyle. Okay.
No, I get that.
They
So he
can't
needs
take a holiday.
right. He needs but he needs an MD, managing director, operations officers, whatever, someone just to take care of the day to day.
Absolutely. So I'm going to move this little slider across. I'm going to increase the cost of salaries by 150,000 a year, give or take. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Um, the impact of that is going to be as follows. This guy is going to come. He's going to help focus on sales. He's going to do a bunch of things around that. He's going to focus on finding other big customers. So by doing that, he's going to reduce the dependency on one big customer from just over 50% to, let's say, 20%. Okay, so he's going to go sign up Sky. He's going to go sign up all these other,
Mm,
competitors to the BBC. It's
yeah.
not going to happen instantly, but it's going to happen. Okay, so that's the first thing that this guy is going to do. He's also going to increase the level of retainer income, restructure that. And the last thing he's going to do, and I'm just doing a very simple example, as a result of that, the growth rate maybe next year is going to be 5 to 10%, but long term, you're putting the structures and the process in place, the business is going to grow at between 10 and 15%. Okay. And importantly, now the owner might not be able to go away 3 weeks uninterrupted, but let's say he can go away for 3 weeks and just be available to his team. So this is
Mm.
a realistic conversation and scenario you can have with a business owner. And you can say, what if? What if you did this? Now, I don't know what the outcome is going to be because I haven't run it before this call, but in
This is
real
going to be
time, if you're an
interesting.
advisor,
The big reveal. Yeah.
the big reveal, yeah. So I click submit. Okay.
I am very interested in what the result's going to
Okay.
be. Wow. Wow. Okay.
And there we
For
go.
for those
Okay.
who are
So
listening to this, you could just run through the numbers. Go on.
100%. So what's happened with those seemingly small changes? Okay. The valuation's gone from 3.7 million quid to just over 10 million quid. Okay.
Mm,
Um, and what did I do? But I'm spending more money. Okay. But the
mm,
result of this is profound for potential acquirer. And that's what a lot of potential acquirers do. The guys in private equity, they look at businesses and say, well, we're going to acquire this business. We're going to make these improvements. And who benefits from the upside valuation? The private equity house when they do the roll up and they
Exactly.
sell it down the line. Now, for
Yeah,
business owners, you want to enjoy that upside. Okay. So a lot of these
absolutely.
things are kind of some of the tricks that, private equity guys would do. I'm not knocking the private equity guys. They do a fantastic job, but a
Hmm.
lot of, it's kind of an unbalanced equation, right? So what we want to do is empower business owners to understand these things and understand what I call the leverage that's inherent in that. Okay. So a lot of business owners, Alan, as we said, don't understand how small changes and changing some of these
Yeah.
parameters can make such a big impact on on their value. This is
Yeah.
their
I mean,
retirement. This is their legacy.
exactly.
And I think that's what makes me so passionate about what we do, is just
Hmm.
seeing when the sort of penny drops for a business owner and they realize this, it's a game changer. Obviously, they need to act on it, but that's kind of, yeah, the end of the demo, I guess.
Um, okay, let me pause there for a second, just so, and I want to just reiterate the numbers. And of course, this is a guide, but it's a pretty damn accurate guide. To be fair, we've been, I've been sort of as you've been adding the data and putting details in throughout. I'm just kind of mentally doing a sense check. Is this about right? Is this, does this feel about accurate in terms of the
Mm,
size of the business, the turnover, the profits, and so on? And it feels pretty damn accurate to me in that. And what we've done is the original valuation, because as I say, it was a decent business. If I met that business owner, I'd be thinking, you're doing well. You are, got a 10 million turnover business. You're profitable. You're having a nice lifestyle. And that valuation is just under 3.7 million. Again, not
yeah,
unreasonable. That's not a small amount of money for an owner, but you can move that almost 3x it. It goes from 3.7 to over 10 million pounds in terms of a valuation. And then you think
yeah,
about the downstream effects of that for that founder, for their family, for their lifestyle, for
mm,
everything else. I mean, that's just, I mean, to use your example, that is definitely moving from economy class or club class to to first class or even flying private. Using that example, that is a significant difference and an impact on their lives. And the interesting thing is, there it was. Yes, we got to assume that. What I took from that, there was a sort of almost a series of domino effects. This is almost it strays into almost business consultancy in a way, in that um, the the big unlock there, I think, was hiring somebody. So you bring someone
mm,
else in, and of course, and I know it, I've been through it myself to some extent in the past. You think, yeah, but they're not revenue generators. You think that's just another cost. I'm going to have to take a haircut on my own dividend this year if I bring someone else in. But the downstream effect
yeah,
of that is you've now got more time. You're kind of off the tools in terms of the day to day. And someone, frankly, if you bring in someone who does that full time, they tend to be a lot better than the founder at actually doing that stuff and executing on running a company. Short term is going to cost you. Longer term, it frees up more time to do what I think
mm,
that the key role of founders is to be the kind of the voice of the company, to go out to meet with other people. Most founders have got a strong black book of contacts and connections, so you're doing that more of, which most of us prefer to do anyway, and that in turn allows you to diversify, look for more
mm,
business, more contacts, and more clients, which is reducing that dependency that in this example they had on one customer. And again, I see a lot of businesses do that. It might not be 50%,
mm,
but they'll have two or three customers that definitely are 50 to 60% of their overall revenue.
mm,
And then by definition, then they can go for a 3 week holiday, and yeah, maybe on the end of a phone call or a WhatsApp or whatever, but they're not absolutely dependent on them being every day. And I guess your metrics sitting behind this are then dropping in and saying, well, that's a positive, that's a positive. And the compound effect of that, as I say, from 3.7 to over 10 million pounds. And the last thing I'll say on that valuation you arrive at then, assuming that this example, they go ahead and execute on these things and this review in a year or two, you would
yeah.
you would stand behind that. You would say, now you'll take this to a potential buyer, and absolutely you could justify looking for, as a starting point, at the very least, a 10 point something million-pound valuation. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just touched on such an important point there, is just because you run the scenario, your business doesn't magically go from 3.5 million quid to 10 million quid.
Mm,
You've got to put in the work. And that's that sort of 18 month to 2 year, sometimes even longer process to do
yeah.
that. I do see a lot of buyers that said, "Oh, we'll just dress this up and tell a potential buyer this story." Okay.
Yeah,
um, but that gets unstuck at due diligence, because when a buyer
of
comes, they're
course.
going to look under the hood and they say, "Well, hey, this number doesn't make sense. You're not really doing this. You can't." I asked your PA, and no, you can't take a 3-week holiday. You're burning the midnight oil. So I think people sometimes think that they can pull the hood over the wire, or pull
Yeah,
the, what's it?
the
I'm
wool
getting
over their
my
eyes.
metaphors mixed up.
But here's the thing that having spoken to a number of like PE and buyers and what have you in various industries, they know that's their upside. They're saying, well, yeah, of course you can do all these things. We're going to do it, and therefore we're going to
Yeah.
take the cost, the risk, and all the other things of doing that, and therefore that's our margin, that's our return, that's how we make these a success. So I think what this is doing is it's
Mm.
empowering that founder to say, you know what, it's a bit of extra work, hassle, cost, but if I can get that sort of return, and who knows, they're not always a 3x, some might be more, some will be less, but there's no question
Some
that
might
you
even
can
go
up.
backwards. Some businesses might even be like
Yeah,
optimized already, and that's great. I think this example is obviously a fairly simple
yeah.
one, but it's not an uncommon one. We see this every single day. Yeah.
Well, look, if you do that, let's face it, if you do this with accurate data and your number is lower in the future, it's time to sell, right? That's giving
Yeah.
you that red flag to say probably an opportune time for you to start speaking with buyers at this stage. That is super interesting. Now, give me, in terms of the sort of commercial realities of this. So this is a facility, it's a tool. I'm going to ask you before we finish up how people can learn more. Ballpark, what are the costs involved if a business owner wanted to do this and go through the process? What would they be expecting to pay?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just kind of break that out. So what I've shown you now is, I guess, what we call our advisory valuation. We do that ourselves. We've got a team that will deliver that online.
Yeah,
That is in the region of 600 quid to go and do that exercise. You get a 45-minute consultation, much like we've done here. And we have
right.
that discussion, and obviously there's the follow up around that. And you've got access to all that data. You can run your own scenarios outside of that. We also have partners who deliver it as a service, around that. And then we have
Right.
other tiers of options, Alan. So let's say, for example, you're going through a divorce and you need something to be defensible in front of HRMC, for our argument's sake. Those options go up to sort of 5,500 quid. But obviously, there's a detailed report that sits behind it. That's going to be able to stand in front of the courts and be
Yeah.
defensible. And then we've got a package that kind of sits in the middle, which is slightly more complicated businesses than what I've used here. Maybe a
Mm.
shareholder buyout, or let's call it more strategic planning. So this example I've shown you is ideal for small to medium-sized business owners. They want a sense check. They want to do some advisory work on their business and understand what they can do. And then the sort of more full service options are when there's a specific event and you're ready. But this is something you should be doing every single year, in my opinion, as a business owner. When you're thinking about renewing your insurance, your key man, your buy sell, thinking
Mm.
about your wealth plan, all of those
Mm.
things, you need to know these numbers. So that's the cost of a meal in London now with a few mates. So,
Yeah, unfortunately, you're not far away from the truth. You're right. £600 is a relatively small sum, and certainly compared to the alternatives, which is going out to some, as you say, some accounting firm, because it would be multiples of that number. So that seems very affordable. And as you say, you sort of started our whole conversation about with the comparison with a health check, a personal health check. I think everyone should, and certainly when you get to a certain age, it's probably worthwhile, just because you'll flag up. If you can flag up things early on, if there are challenges, then you can take some action to manage those. And it's the same. This probably the second most important thing for business owners after their health. It's likely to be their business, because that then fuels their family's lifestyle and everything else. So the ability to do this and check in at a relatively modest cost, and just see, and if nothing else, it's like, let's do a first off check in. Where are we? What is our? Because we think everything in the business
yeah,
world is all like rumors and conversations and a chat you had with your accountant in the bar one day, and all this. This puts some rigor around it, which is what I really like. It gives you sort of a starting point. And then,
yeah,
and the other thing that strikes me is that pretty much every entrepreneur that I know, they're goal driven. There's a reason they started a business in the first place.
Mm,
If I was looking at that and I thought, well, if I do all these various changes, I can move my valuation from 3 million to 10 million over the next couple of years, then, that's exactly, I would begin a strategy to execute on that, because why the hell wouldn't I?
yeah.
And that would be, so I think this is the point. You unleash that kind of entrepreneurial spirit of those business
Mm,
owners to say, fine, we now need to take we would perhaps one or two short-term backward steps in terms of, revenue and costs. You'd have to spend some money, but with the
mm,
intention of creating a significant material uplift to the value of the
mm.
business. So I think you empower these business owners to go ahead and do something, build something more valuable.
It's
And
exactly
also
that.
the other thing,
The,
yeah, go on. Sorry.
sorry to interrupt you. No business owner knows their business better than they do, but they know their business. If you're a plumber, you know plumbing better than anyone else.
Yeah,
But do you necessarily know how to maximize the value on your business? That's actually a different business altogether. That's where the
right.
M&A guys play and whatever. And that's what we're giving a glimpse into, Alan. The last thing I want to just say on that is we will always tell the business owner what they need to hear, not
Mm,
necessarily what they want to hear. And that's
yeah,
why it's so important that this is not just an online tool or an online platform. You've got to be able to deliver that message with I think compassion, understanding, because a lot of business owners looking at that say, "What do you mean my business isn't already worth 20 million quid?" You know?
yes, exactly.
uh, I've already
Yeah,
bought the
because
Lamborghini for retirement. So,
that's right.
yeah, I
I
just wanted
know.
to kind of emphasize that.
No, that makes sense. Now the other thing, and this comes out a lot, I think, in many of the conversations I've had on this pod over the years, is that you need time.
Yeah.
The last thing you want is to decide you want to sell your business and you want to do it in the next 3 months. I mean, you can
Mm,
do that, but you're certainly not going to optimize the value of your business, because I guess you're going to find, a number of just tools and tactics that most businesses, very few businesses, are sort of spot on, perfect, and optimized. And they're likely to have between one and, I don't know, five or so different levers they can pull within the business, but they just take time. You can't bring in a sort of a world class operator, MD, operations person, for example, tomorrow. That's going to take
yeah.
6 months, and and building the platform for growth, that's going to take a year or two to show some forward momentum. So I think that's the key message here: is
Mhm.
you need to give yourself time, but you need to find out what it is you're trying to do first of all. And this gives you, I guess, this gives people a framework to say, right, in order for me to achieve these kind of outcomes, there's these three things we need to do in the next 2 years. So, and as I said earlier on, a lot of entrepreneurs just say, look, just tell me what to do. I'll go and do it. It's not executing.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the challenge. It's knowing exactly what to prioritize and what to execute on. So this is, this has been really helpful. And as I say, in terms of offering some resource and value to the bulletproof entrepreneur community, and there's, we've got quite a few thousands of people who tune in now to the podcast, and the majority of them are exactly in that sort of framework, in a sort of running a medium-sized business. Some are kind of
Mm,
earlier
mm.
stage. I've spoken to a few kind of more at the startup stage, but again, you can apply this across wherever you are, if you've got a mature business or if you're relatively early stage. So I think it really is a valuable tool in the toolbox of any founder, any entrepreneur, anyone tuning into this. So if people want to learn more about your services, where should I send them?
Yeah, I think, Alan, the easiest would be to go to our website. It's www.bizval with a Z global.com. And you'll find everything you need to know there. Or, I'm happy to give my email address out as well. It's Graham, spelt the right way, Graham or HAM at bizvalglobal.com. I've now just offended every Graham who's spelled with a EM or EME.
Yes, I know a few of them.
Uh, but yeah, that's probably the easiest way to get hold of us. Or catch me on LinkedIn. You'll find me there. Yeah.
Okay, we'll put links to your website, to your LinkedIn profile, and your email address, and hopefully people are going to reach out and see how you can help them. I'm for empowering entrepreneurs, and whatever we can do as a community just to help each other, to support each other without necessarily having to break the bank. So I think what you're doing is fabulous. So, Graham, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And for now, take care and all the best.
Alan, thanks very much. Such a pleasure to be here and hope to see you soon.